Is here as one of our guest speakers. You probably know who he is. If you are here, wrote the book, The Case for Christian Nationalism. Funny story on that. When his book first came out, Chase and I went to Denver Seminary, and they decided to host an event that was basically anti that book. And they had a bunch of speakers there that were lame. So Chase and I decided to buy a whole box of Case for Christian Nationalism, and we went to that conference and gave out the books. So it was a good time. So excited to have Dr. Wolfe here with us. So would you please welcome him to the stage?
All right, well, it's a joy to be here. As a native Californian, I know many of you don't like Californians, and it's understandable why. But being here, it kind of feels a little bit like California. The air feels like California. I live now in North Carolina. That's the native state of my children, but not me. But it feels kind of like my native home here, and it's a joy to be here. Even though 5,300 feet is actually doing something to me. So if I get lightheaded and pass out, it's not because of anything except the air. But anyway, I'm glad to be here. Yeah, so I started the Institute of Christian Politics, and the idea there is to train intellectually gifted young men to enter into our institutions and influence, if not take over those institutions. So if you're interested in that, let me know. And I can give you the QR code to give me money for that. But please at least check that out and at least pray for the ministry. Or it's not a ministry, but anyway, the Institute. All right, so here we go. For our entire lives, we've understood American politics to be a divide between the liberals and the conservatives. My talk today will question whether this divide is actually accurate. More specifically, whether the conservatives are actually non-liberals. But I submit that American conservatives are politically liberal, and they are the same type of liberal as those we commonly call liberal. At one level, this is trivially true, for we might say that the American tradition is a liberal tradition, but my claim is not that conservatives are classical liberals, as they sometimes call themselves. They are modern liberals. So here's my definition for modern liberal. They're modern liberals because, well, they are liberal in a modern way. So I define modern liberalism as the belief that civil society is a space for the abstract human. The human abstracted from any cultural particularity and robust moral vision. And the end of modern liberalism, or the purpose of it, is to politically secure each individual's opportunity to define for himself the meaning of his own existence. So it's to define for himself the meaning of his own existence. That is the end or purpose of modern liberalism. So by abstract human, I mean the human stripped of all cultural features. He is the universal man, though he is an impoverished one, because this abstract man of liberalism is not one who affirms all universal truths, which would include moral truths and religious truths. The abstract human of liberalism is one stripped to a bare bones humanity that fits well into a commercial or a market society, a society of modern production and consumption. So whatever suits that end, that is modern production and consumption, that's kind of what the abstract human is. So in the eyes of the state, humans are functionally equal so that they can enter into contracts freely with others, mainly as employees and employers. And they're equal in their right to be or to try to become their self-chosen identity. All right, so that's in the eyes of the state. They are free to contract with business relations, and also they have a right to be or become whatever their self-chosen identity might be. So I'm not saying that modern liberalism denies man cultural or ethnic particularity. You can have nearly any sort of identity that you want. Modern liberalism merely regards those identities as functionally irrelevant to politics. They're functionally irrelevant, since they have, to their minds, no bearing on commercial life. Whether one is Hindu or Christian, whether you consider gay marriage moral or immoral, whether your family has been here for generations or you just got off the boat, none of those things has any bearing on politics and modern liberalism. So you may seek to persuade in the public sphere others of your moral beliefs, say that, homosexuality is sinful. But you may not assert that claim as a citizen to see that it is enacted in civil policy. So you can participate in the public discourse, but not as citizen, because that would impose that sort of morality upon your society, which is irrelevant to their minds to anything concerning commerce. Because they believe that homosexuality has little effect on commerce or other people, and individuals have a right to define for themselves the meaning of their own existence. So you may cherish your homeland all you want, but you may never claim your homeland to be a place for a particular people with some historical connection to it. For in modern liberalism, your land is one for any abstract human who can affirm a small set of universal propositions, which every human can affirm in virtue of their universal faculties. Modern liberalism treats anathema any political claim to a place based on ancestry, culture, or ethnicity. In modern liberalism, political life is not conceived in its classical sense as an ordering to a common good or a collective life. Politics is not the promotion of virtue besides those virtues associated with modern commercial life. So strong moral claims and religious claims are placed in the private sphere, and they must not be the ends of public policy. As an example, you may find the porn shop just off the highway to be morally repugnant, but closing down that business through political means is forbidden, and your only recourse is persuasion or gospel conversion, as conservative Christians might say. If the government closes down that shop, then your Christian flower business might be next. It is, after all, the individual's choice both to start such businesses, and it's the individual's choice to be its customers. Your duty is to mind your own business. We're told by both the left liberal, or the left-wing liberal, and the conservative that it's not the government's business to regulate such commerce. If we suppress one identity or lifestyle or some comprehensive moral claim, or we exclude this or that group from citizenship, then the government might suppress or exclude others, even you and yours. And that sort of thing reeks of Nazism, the ultimate evil. If liberty, even for the conservative, is rebranded away from its historic meaning as the freedom to do what is right, and it's reduced to license, or to be more precise, the old dichotomy between liberty and license is confounded, and what constitutes license is left undetermined in political reasoning. It is left to the individual to decide which actions are truly liberating. Now, the conservative might complain constantly about our society's descent into immorality, but that is mere personal opinion. For his commitment to the modern notion of liberty prevents him from any political means to promote morality and to suppress immorality. Take, for example, the conservative response to homosexual school teachers talking about their gay marriages. You might have heard this in the last several years. The conservative does not repudiate this by saying that immorality has no place in the classroom. Rather, they claim that teachers should not be talking about their personal lives at all. That's their response. So instead of promoting the good, what is good and wholesome, namely the sort of marriage that God ordained, instead of teachers being role models of true morality in character, conservatives would prefer that teachers be amoral, impersonal, and morally neutral. So when they respond to the politically assertive left, the conservatives do not assert politics or a positive moral vision that excludes what is evil. Their move is only to avoid or eliminate politics, reducing everything to moral neutrality or to private belief. But for most of Western history, politics extended to nearly every aspect of what makes one a complete human. That doesn't mean that everything is an object of civil policy. It just means that every aspect of public life is part of the polis, or our life together. And the freedom to act was freedom to promote a virtuous and a pious community. That's what our tradition has said. Our tradition is quite clear. The terminus of an individual's action is actually the good of the commonwealth, not merely one's own personal good. Indeed, nearly everyone in Western political history affirmed that private advantage ought to be sacrificed to the common advantage. In other words, the good of the state is the ultimate end of ethical and even familial action. Now, those ideas are not creations of Rousseau or Hegel or some early 20th century right-wing writer. It is simply the standard position of Western history, reflected not only in classical philosophy, Aristotle, Cicero, Virgil, Seneca, and medieval philosophy such as Aquinas, or in the early modern period, such as Althusius and other Reformed writers, but even among the American founders and well into the 19th and 20th centuries. That again, the ultimate terminus of ethical and familial action is the good of the Commonwealth. The Federalist Papers and the state constitutions regularly speak of the common good, and of course our U.S. Constitution speaks of a general welfare. But after World War II, we decided to suppress the strong gods of old who called for more organic nations in which the person, family, and association were parts of some whole or ordered to a common good. In the interest of never again, modern liberalism abandoned the idea that we find the ultimate earthly good of our actions in their contribution to the glory of the Commonwealth. Fearing that the state might marginalize one group again, we decided not to marginalize any group. Fearing that the majority culture might disfavor a minority group, we decided not to disfavor any minority group. Or to be more precise, we decided that the majority cultures among Western nations are not peoples and have no rights as such, while the minority groups among them are peoples and have minority rights. If the majority culture is disbanded, displaced in heart, and deracinated, it is no longer a threat to any minority group. It is never again in the form of a minority ethnic strategy. This arrangement is often called asymmetric multiculturalism. So look that up, asymmetric multiculturalism, to get more on that. So as for religious influence, even if religion is allowed to influence the public square, which some liberals actually reject altogether, the end of that influence must be in support of this central proposition, that civil society is a space of the abstract human. It is no surprise that conservative Christian political theology almost entirely serves this end, typically using things like there is neither Greek nor Jew, nor male nor female, or the Imago Dei. Our political theology must conform to liberal ideology. Indeed, nearly every single political theology developed over the last several decades, from Van Drunen's novel to kingdom theology to Jonathan Leeman's Baptist theology, conforms to this very end. And also some versions of theonomy do as well. And even among conservatives who claim that the United States was or is a Christian nation, such as Mark David Hall, a great scholar and good guy, for them still the Christian part is necessary for a universalist project, serving as the ground of religious liberty for all and for the freedom of all. And with this strange logic, they claim that Christianity in the nation is a necessary foundation for the nation of the abstract human. This is what Judeo-Christian values refers to. It's the universalizing of the nation for the abstract human. Adding the Judeo part renders the nation formally non-Christian. It is a way of saying that there is Christian influence without following the logic to Christian nation. It is a way of universalizing Christian values so that non-Christians are not second-class citizens. It leads, of course, to a practical contradiction, to the destruction of the Christian part, as it provides no political means to prevent its replacement by non-Christians. So it's really a contradictory phrase, ends up destroying the Christian part, which we've seen. So in modern liberalism, no particular culture may make any exclusive claim to any place. If cultural particularities are brought to politics, that is, if we appeal to some historical connection to people and place, it must be an appeal to a universalizing project. So we hear lines like, "We are a nation of immigrants," or "melting pot." "We have always been multi-ethnic. We were founded on ideas and propositions." We hear that our forefathers began an experiment in liberty that we have progressively realized over time, slowly becoming the land of promise, a land of, for, and by the abstract human. Our history starts with the Declaration. It moves to the Civil War, then to women's suffrage, and to the Civil Rights era. The conservatives continue it with Reagan's recasting of the Pilgrims as the quintessential migrants, fleeing tyranny to be industrious. From here, we move to gay rights. Isn't it interesting that the universal nation, one based on abstractions, still appeals to its ancestors and founders and a particular history to define itself? No matter how hard the conservatives try, you cannot avoid ancestry in defining a nation. The only historical narrative that we're allowed to offer, the only good one, is one of universal propositions initially promised to all humanity and then slowly and painfully realized over time. The posterity mentioned in the preamble of the Constitution came to mean any human who, one way or the other, finds his feet on American dirt. The recent immigrant who affirms all the propositions about equality and human rights is deemed a better countryman than one whose love of country is rooted in ancestry, whose fathers participated in the great acts of this nation's history, and whose heart is lodged here, not somewhere else. Indeed, a man residing in America whose heart is lodged in India, Mexico, Africa, or Israel, but who affirms all the propositions and makes some show of industry is more American than one whose heart is lodged here in America, who has nowhere else to go, and yet loves this soil because his fathers are buried in it. The only difference between the left liberal and the conservative on this is the extent to which America has progressed into abstract humanity. The left liberals insist that the United States has not progressed far enough. For this reason, government must advantage non-whites, women, homosexuals, and others in order to equalize them with whites, men, and heterosexuals. The conservative, for his part, differs only in assuming that we've already progressed into abstract humanity. Affirmative action and other government programs are no longer necessary. Formally and structurally, says the conservative, all have equal opportunity to achieve at least a middle-class existence, the American dream. But ironically, the conservatives' historical narrative is more progressive than the progressives. It's one of the great ironies of conservatism nowadays. Because the big P progressive, for them, American history began with the promise of equality and has made some formal progress to that end with the end of slavery, Civil Rights Act, and LGBT rights, but oppressive structures still exist, and inequality continues to plague us. The visible structure gives the appearance of formal equality, but invisible oppressive structures remain. This explains to their minds, for example, why blacks continue to lag behind on most socioeconomic indicators and other indicators. While conservatives think that we've already achieved a society of abstract humanity, the left liberal disagrees. But the conservatives' narrative is not much different. The main difference is that they emphasize only the formal legal progress of American history. The Civil War, Civil Rights Act resolved the race question, and women's suffrage and women in the workplace resolved the gender question. Instead of being fundamentally evil, America has always been good in principle, and the flowering of its potential is the good, really the only good, that we find in American history. Now that legal equality is established and freedom of association in economic life is legally restricted, all are free to be or become whatever they want. The conservative only asks that you be industrious to contribute to GDP. The conservatives constantly cry stop at demands for more progress, though their date for when history ended keeps shifting later and later. Today, most conservatives have no interest in questioning homosexual marriage, and conservative influencers congratulate gay men who acquire infants through surrogacy, as if children are a commodity. Now, the conservative and the left liberal have largely the same political philosophy. For both, America is a land of the abstract human, as I've said, deserving equal opportunity to define for himself the meaning of his own existence. The main difference pertains to the means to the shared ends. So same principles, same ends, different means. And the issue of the means concerns the necessity and effectiveness of government redistribution. Conservatives don't want redistribution, the liberals do, left liberals. But let me say that the left liberal is actually more attuned to reality than the conservative on this point. That is not to say that I support massive redistribution. My claim is that the left liberals, their reasoning is actually more valid. The left liberal recognizes that legal equality, that is, the legal structural ability to achieve one's dream, has not produced equality and likely cannot. Inequality, at least along racial lines, has increased since the civil rights era. If legal equality hasn't produced equality among various ethnic and racial groups, then either some groups are better in some ways than others, or there continues to be socially constructed hindrances to equality. No liberal, whether he's a left liberal or a conservative, will accept the former explanation, so it must be the latter. The conservative, however, has no answer to this except to blame disparities on culture or some vague reference to legacies of racism. They have no solution beside doubling down on freedom and getting government out of the way. The left liberals, to my mind at least, have a coherent explanation and a means to achieve the ends that they share with conservatives. Conservatives want to kind of keep the status quo and think things will sort themselves out. And the left liberal says, well, you need actually government to actually solve inequality. As for history, the conservatives and the left liberals share many of the same heroes and the same villains of American history. And they follow the same general principle, which is asymmetry. All non-whites may have heroes of their own for their own groups. Okay? While white heroes are those who in some way made America a land for the non-white. The founding fathers, for example, though generally rejected by left liberals, are universal fathers, and they are good precisely because their experiment made America a land for any and all. That is how conservatives justify their love for the founders, despite their faults. That they created a universal nation, or to put it in my framing, they established the promise of a nation of the abstract human. So white heroes are universalized, that is, fathers for all, really anyone in the whole world who comes here, while non-white heroes are heroes for specific groups. And of course, all the villains of American history are white and typically male. Now, the conservatives claim to reject identity politics, and they have three main reasons for this. The first is that America has progressed sufficiently to become a land of the abstract human, as I've talked about. Thus, identity politics is unnecessary for hardworking individuals to succeed. The second reason they offer to reject identity politics, and the one that I hear the most, is that non-white identity politics might lead to white identity politics. And that is their greatest fear. You hear that line over and over and over. It is evident that conservatives do not care in itself that blacks, Hispanics, Asians, Indians, and every other non-white group would organize and be openly self-affirming and even publicly express racial or ethnic loyalty. The conservatives' greatest fear is that whites become self-affirming. We hear this repeatedly. Indeed, Rod Dreher, who, by the way, is an abysmal character, recently said this in a widely shared podcast. You might have seen that on Twitter. But Dreher doesn't care when blacks congratulate themselves for Drake and Dre, unless it leads whites to congratulate themselves for Bach and Beethoven. The conservative celebrators show little concern over race swapping in movies when the historical character or figure is white, but they would be appalled if white actors appeared in Mulan, Moana, Black Panther, or any other story of non-white origin or geographic setting. The conservative does not care about non-white self-affirmation itself. They care about it only because whites might de-universalize themselves and come to the same self-affirmation. Their fundamental animating principle is not opposition to identity politics per se, but opposition to white identity politics. Deep down in their subconscious, they might actually believe that when white ethnic groups self-affirm, they tend to subjugate the world, or perhaps worse, we would get another Third Reich. Lastly, the conservative hates identity politics because identity politics calls into question their own commitment to universality, or America as a special place for humanity to become individuals. Put another way, it calls into question whether America is a place where universal man, which is the white man's modern state of existence, is replicated. But the prevalence of identity politics in America, and indeed its ubiquity around the world, suggests to the conservatives that their universality might not be universal, that their mere human beliefs might be more culturally conditioned than once thought, and that they belong, perhaps unconsciously, to a particular people with particular ideas in a particular place. In my view, conservatives are actually more delusional than their left-wing counterparts. You see, the conservative does not merely believe in human equality and natural rights. They also believe that free markets, altruism, reciprocity, and merit, and they believe in the evil of ethnocentrism, fraud, graft, and bribery. All those things are as obvious to humankind as they are to them. That is, they believe that all those things from human equality, natural rights, altruism, reciprocity, the evil of fraud, graft, bribery, all that is all as obvious to humankind generally as it is to them. And America to them has magic dirt. The moment one steps on it, one suddenly rejects all the norms he grew up with and all the norms that his fathers once considered normal. In my view, the conservatives today, even more than their counterparts, are ideologues. This is one of the great ironies of modern conservatism, which has prided itself during and after the Cold War on its rejection of ideology. Despite all the evidence that third world immigration produces third world societies, they still believe in the power of the American proposition to change hearts and minds. Despite the fact that nearly every immigrant group, on average, going back to the Ellis Island immigrants, vote for Democrats, the conservatives still believe that education or their own efforts somehow will convince humankind of their self-evident truths. In large part, they simply ignore these realities. And when you point it out, they call you names. The Christians among them call you anti-Christian for noticing that most humans do not share their Western propositions. Apart from basic experience, the evidence from social science is soundly against their abstractions and their ideological universalism. So researchers have shown that people matter much more than the place in determining social trust, prosperity, good governance, and technological advancement. This is certainly true of Southeast Asian countries with strong Chinese minorities who are always economically on top over the more indigenous, no matter how long they've resided there. But this is also true of Europeans. Economists, such as David Weil, Louis Putterman, they've argued the following. If the only thing you knew about each nation on the planet was the fraction of that nation with ancestors of European descent, you'd be able to predict 2/3 of all global income differences. All right, so if all you knew was the composition of with European ancestry, you could predict 2/3 of the income differences. That's as summarized by a man named Garrett Jones, who wrote a book called, I believe, The Culture Transplant. So I recommend it's a small book, Cultural Transplant, something like that. It's a very good book. So a growing body of research indicates that the people matter more than the actual place. The purpose here is not to prove some genetic supremacy. It's not my purpose here, but to simply point out that regardless of the cause, the data show that descendants of Europeans produce more prosperous countries. That might be an inconvenient fact, but it's true. And also better governance, and technological advancement. And it's rivaled only by East Asians, namely the Chinese. We can conclude from this data that reducing the European composition of any country will, unless replaced by Chinese, harm the well-being of that country. and certainly undermine the Western character of its institutions. In my experience, even in the face of this evidence, the conservative doubles down or gives an anecdote about his immigrant friend. The conservative simply cannot free himself from his delusion because it would require him to step out of his universality. That is, he would have to move away from his belief that his ideas, such as free markets, toleration, merit, and individualism, and also aspects of his way of life such as reciprocity, altruism, fairness, he'd have to step away from the idea that composes a self-evident and universal way of life. But the conservative must believe down to his soul that his thoughts are obvious, that they're obviously human thoughts, and that all humans with the right education and geographic location will and must readily affirm them. He must double down on that. But in the face of the reality, conservatives can choose either to ignore that fact, these inconvenient facts, which most do, or he can try to explain them, and some actually do try. But most, in my experience, just ignore reality. They call people names. I've heard things that it's pagan and anti-Christian to provide data on top of our own experience to demonstrate that worldism endures among those from the third world on average. However, if he chooses to explain reality, his explanation must avoid white supremacy and avoid denying human equality. He must insist that his thoughts are universal, not particular to his own people group, since he doesn't, to his mind, belong to a particular people group. It's one of the things that conservatives tend not to think that they belong to an actual people group. The conservative calls himself an American, but everybody residing outside the United States is a potential American. To be American is to be the universal man who affirms the self-evident and universal propositions. That's the conservatives' thinking. They refuse to believe that their ideas are suitable only for a particular people with a particular heritage and a particular way of life. They refuse to escape universality. Then what move does the conservative make to explain his failure to convince the freedom-loving foreigner who comes here? He either blames fellow conservatives that they didn't try hard enough, or he blames left-wing wokeism, which is another way of blaming ideology. In conservative discourse, the term ideology is used to explain why their obvious beliefs are rejected by so many. They claim that people are captured by ideology. Rhetorically, it functions to shore up in their own minds the universal obviousness of their beliefs, and to assert, quite without any evidence, that the third world immigrant would believe, and already deep down does, what the conservatives believe. If only that pesky ideology, which clouds minds from reality, would get out of the way. To my mind, a much better explanation, one that conforms to reality, is that third worlders actually believe third world politics, which is socialism and ethnocentrism, and they tend toward third world vices, which is bribery, fraud, and graft. Add to that a bit of resentment toward the West, and you have a complete explanation. But again, the conservative cannot believe any of that because it questions the universality of his beliefs and his way of life. And worst of all, it would mean that he belongs to an actual people, a people whose ideas and way of life exclude most people in the world. His mind simply will not permit him to think that way, mostly because it makes him feel like a Nazi. And the Nazi is the ultimate evil. You laugh because you know it's true. The left liberal is less delusional. He's less delusional because he knows that the immigrant will affirm certain basic propositions, though instrumentally, and will vote for bigger government. They do both of these things on behalf not of universal truth, but for the good of their own people group. Muslims and Hindus will support religious liberty not because they believe in it as a universal and absolute limitation on government, but because it serves the interest of their minority group. It's instrumentalized. Conservatives believe it in principle, whereas immigrants tend to believe it instrumentally for the good of their own group. Okay? And the conservative tends to kind of impute altruism on them as well, even though it's all adopted instrumentally. And the same thing for big government, because democratic government is a pay-to-play system. Vote for the Democrats, and the Democrats provide you ethnic advantages. So for this reason, the left liberal, they understand the game, and in a very pragmatic way. They are, ideological in a way. I won't deny that. But they're not delusional in practical terms. They know that immigrant groups will not naturally universalize themselves into American individualism. But I will say that the few who do, are immediately placed by the Republicans in positions of influence. Like immediately. I'm surprised at how few actually take up that offer, right? I mean, because there's two things. The two things boomer conservatives, sorry boomers, but I have to say this. The two things that boomer conservatives like the most are, one, the legs on Fox News Channel, and two, they love racial minorities denouncing identity politics and socialism. If you ever go to a GOP meeting, anyway. No, but I'm actually kind of surprised why Black Americans don't realize that they could literally show up and start using all this language, and they would immediately become a host on Fox News. I don't know why they don't do it. It makes perfect sense to me, but. Okay, back to the point. The Democrats know that in general, immigrants and blacks will think and act with a group identity and for the good of their group. The Democrats, therefore, promise advantages and privileges to these groups with rhetoric of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Furthermore, the left liberals know that they can wield the immigrants' enduring colonial animosities against the whiteness of the conservatives. It all actually makes sense pragmatically, even though it is devilish and bad for our country. The conservatives, bless their hearts, have no clue what to do. They have views that very few in the world affirm, yet think they're obvious and universal, and they try in vain to convince the world of them, constantly failing. They conceal the contradiction in their own minds by blaming it on ideology or communism. And so Mayor Mondami in New York, to their minds, is a product not of the third world, but of ideology. They never learn from their failures and continue to support legal immigration, thinking that these legal immigrants, upon seeing the taxes taken from their first paycheck, will suddenly turn them into laissez-faire capitalists. In reality, they and their children and their children's children will vote for Democrats, retain their animosities, and practice ethnocentrism. Again, on average, I'm not talking about each one. Where did these conservatives come from? How did this actually come about? The conservatives I have in mind are largely those whose politics came out of the Reagan administration, a man still praised widely among them. Most famously, Reagan recast the Pilgrims, who settled early New England, as the paragon example of migrants fleeing tyranny in order to be free to work hard. Their story tells us that, quote, our door must be open to anyone with the will and heart to get here. That's what Reagan said in his farewell address. For him, everyone in the world is a potential American. Of course, Reagan mixed up the historical facts, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that the Puritans, who sought a land to worship God rightly, were recast as migrants seeking a place for freedom, or what the Pilgrims would actually call license, and unhindered commercial life. In other words, that historic story was updated in the 1980s to suit a certain political agenda. And that's just obviously true. And it's historically inaccurate, but it was updated to serve a new sort of liberal nationalism. And anyone today who would trek through dangerous paths and waters to get here is at heart a freedom lover and true American. For Reagan and the conservatives since him, an American is any industrious human. This image of the huddled masses seeking freedom was stamped into the psyche of the conservative, and for most, it will never be replaced, no matter what reality throws at it. They are ideologues. Conservatism today is an ideology. Now, since every industrious man is a potential American, the conservative loves to subject their own native population to international labor competition. Your average Native American, that is one who was born and raised on American soil, wants some meaningful trade or job, wants to own a house, start a business, and have a life of quiet dignity. That is a life of both income-producing work and leisure with friends and family. But he is relentlessly subjected to international labor pressures by immigrants who are less concerned with that sort of way of life. What's worse, such immigrants tend to be ethnocentric. They take cash for work, they accept lower wages, and they care little about the living standards that older American generations have enjoyed. Many conservatives blame Native Americans for being lazy, for not working 12-hour days or more, and for refusing to take less pay than otherwise. Because the conservative cares only for the industrious, abstract human, not anyone or any people in particular. Again, the moment that the conservative begins to identify with some people as their own over others, he betrays his own fundamental principle, namely universality, and his psyche, his psychology, triggers Nazi bells. Yet the looming threat of Nazism captivates the mind of the conservative. The moment that begins to believe that politics is for the common good of a particular people, not merely for individuals as such, or for all of humanity, he begins to hear socialist bells. And as they like to remind us repeatedly, the Nazis were socialists. Okay? So when we tell the conservatives that young people are inheriting a society, let me say it again. When we tell conservatives that young people are inheriting a society of lower social trust, which is true, that is where social trust now has become a sort of commodity, right? So for most generations, there was a high degree of social trust where you could live largely anywhere, and among your neighbors, there would be a higher social trust, okay? It wasn't something that you had to make a certain amount of money to achieve. But now social trust is actually a commodity. That is, you purchase it in the housing market, and it's very expensive, right? That's our situation today. If you want to live in a decent neighborhood, you have to make a lot of money. But in the face of this, the conservative will remind us of cheap televisions and iPhones. So we have all these little things, these gadgets, these things that with higher, I guess we have higher purchasing power. But in the end, the better good, which is a common social trust, is something that you must purchase and make a certain amount of money to achieve, which of course means to dual-income households, all sorts of things. I won't get into that too far, but. Now, in many ways, I am a conservative. I prefer free markets. I want a society where one advances by merit in conditions of fairness. I want ordered liberty. The difference, however, is that I see ordered liberty in the American sense as an inheritance from a people suited for it. The conservative, however, thinks that it's all so natural and human, that socialism, ethnocentrism, bribery, and graft are so unnatural that people will see right away how anti-human it all is. And when placing one's bare feet on the American sandy shores, it grants mere humanity the special powers to see it. That's the conservative thinking. But of course, they mostly do not. Of course, there are exceptions. But as immigrants fill our country, we see unrelenting identity politics and ethnic favoritism. We see immigrants showing not gratitude, but hostility to the very country that received them. Now, the conservatives will say that something went wrong. Perhaps it is because we, lost our educational institutions, which we did. But most likely, what happened was simply humanity itself. Abstract humans do not really exist, but rather humans exist in the world as something, as people groups, with enduring political ideas, old hostilities, and favoritism. That is reality. And the more the conservative denies it, the more he descends into ideology. So conservative might claim that they're simply following in the footsteps of the founders or the American liberal tradition, but this is false. They are modern liberals. because they limit the objects of political relevance to a limited set of universal truths, stripping away from relevance any cultural or religious unity. But this view of civil society and government is neither properly liberal, in my view, nor even American, at least not before World War II. At the time of the founding, the American population was 80% British, 98% Protestant. Though there were distinctions, English cultural regions, though there were distinct English cultural regions in North America, they were already self-consciously American well before the American founding. So historians point to like the Great Awakening as the initial cause, and sometimes call it even ethnogenesis. So you have kind of disparate colonies, but because of the Great Awakening, which occurred before the American founding, there's a sort of ethnogenesis. That is a creation of a people through common experience. One researcher, Eric Kaufman, whose books I recommend, Eric Kaufman, he calls this a British-American self-consciousness, okay? So the Americans consider themselves part of the British political tradition. In 1774, the Continental Congress published something called the Declaration and Resolves. And they sought recognition of their rights according to the, quote, immutable laws of nature, the principles of the English Constitution, and the 7 charters and compacts. They declared these rights, quote, as Englishmen, as their ancestors in like cases usually have done for asserting and vindicating their rights and liberties, end quote. Thus, they sought their rights according to the manner of their particular ethnic tradition as Englishmen. We see here the universal and the particular, the latter being necessary to maintaining the former. Old English liberties, codified or symbolized in the Magna Carta, were frequently asserted, most earnestly by figures like Samuel Adams. Even the Declaration of Independence, though emphasized today for its universalistic language, closes its list of grievances by appealing to their British brethren, accusing the king of being, quote, deaf to the voice of consanguinity. That means they're deaf to the voice of shared blood. And of course, the preamble of the Constitution identifies its chief end, the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. So among the founding generation, actually well into the 20th century, Americans affirmed a sort of Anglo-Saxonism. This is something you don't usually learn in high school history, or probably college either, which linked together the American spirit of liberty to the Saxon liberties of old. So Thomas Jefferson was the most insistent. He said Americans were, quote, led by Hengist and Horsa, the Saxon chiefs from whom we claim the honor of being descended, and whose political principles and form of government we have assumed, end quote. In another place, he says, has not every restitution of the ancient Saxon had happy effects? Is it not better now that we return at once into that happy system of our ancestors, the wisest and most perfect ever yet devised by the wit of man as it stood before the 8th century? This animating myth that Americans were the immigrated remnants of the Anglo-Saxon was also articulated by Benjamin Franklin and Charles Carroll, and later by 19th century historians such as George Bancroft, William Prescott. Anglo-Saxonism is found in the works of Walt Whitman, Henry Adams, Henry Cabot Lodge, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and my favorite, Jack London. By the way, you should read Valley of the Moon. So anyway, Valley of the Moon is a great book, novel. Of course, Anglo-Saxonism is more myth than fact. Okay, I'll say that. Though it's not entirely without fact. But it speaks nevertheless to the idea of an intertwining of people, ancestry, and American principles. It was affirmed even by those who insisted on the universality of those principles. In other words, they believed that, yes, there are natural rights. Natural rights are for everyone. But that what undergirded that, the recognition of it, the ability to use those natural rights well in a position of political liberty, it was undergirded by a sort of way of life or mutual understanding. So the culture, the particulars, were necessary for ordered liberty. So one crucial question following the war for independence was the possibility of political unity among the former colonies. There was self-conscious Americanness prior to the war, but the war itself completed that unity. Indeed, their mutually shared struggle was appealed to in key times to justify a stronger national government. So the very famous one is Federalist 2 by John Jay. He says, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs, and who by their joint counsels, arms, and efforts, fighting side by side throughout a long and bloody war, have nobly established general liberty and independence. So Federalist Papers were trying to argue for the Constitution. One of the disputes was, can we actually have unity given the history of having disparate colonies? John Jay says, yes, we can. He doesn't simply say because we affirm all the same universal propositions. Rather, it's because we have the same manners and customs, same religion, same ancestors, and that undergirded that ability to have that unity. Perhaps less known is George Washington's farewell address, where he says, with slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. You have fought in a common cause and triumphed together. The independence and liberty you possess are the work of joint counsels and joint efforts, of common dangers, suffering, and successes. Right? Manners, habits, and a common experience. Right? Though Washington and Jay were not simply stating facts, but they were arguing for political unity by a direct appeal to cultural homogeneity or cultural similarity, acknowledging a crucial principle, and that is cultural similarity is necessary for political unity. Affirming universal propositions was not enough. And actually, the founders, contrary to popular opinion, were not keen on diversity, immigration, or ethnic difference. Benjamin Franklin was famously hostile to German immigrants. If you're German, it's fine. But he didn't like the Germans very much. He actually sought to, quote, anglify them. Thomas Jefferson feared that European immigration would, quote, render America a heterogeneous, incoherent, distracted mass. I wonder what he'd say today. Ironically, for our time, given pop culture, Alexander Hamilton, he was white, by the way, was adamantly against non-Anglo immigration. He was adamantly against non-Anglo immigration, that is, non-English immigration. He says that the safety of a republic depends essentially on the energy of a common national sentiment and on that love of country which almost invariably is connected with birth, education, and family. Foreigners will generally be apt to bring with them attachments to the persons they have left behind, to the country of their nativity, and to its particular customs and manners. They will also entertain opinions on government, congenial with those under which they have lived. Or if they should be led hither from a preference to ours, how extremely unlikely is it that they will bring with them that temperate love of liberty so essential to republicanism? That's Alexander Hamilton. By the way, what he said there is expressed throughout the Western tradition. I can do one of those things where I give you 50 quotes and embarrass you on Twitter if you call me out on that. But which is my favorite move to do. It's like, that's not true. Okay, here's like 30 guys who said that, and you all respect them. So, but really, that's not like a new opinion. That is just literally, reflected throughout the entire Western political tradition. So finally, James Madison spoke of Americans as having, quote, a kindred blood, such they can live together as members of the same family. He wanted to limit immigration only to those who, quote, really meant to incorporate into our society. Okay? All this, surprisingly, I guess, all this comes from the great political theorists of the American creed. Were they wildly inconsistent? No. While they affirmed that natural rights are universal rights, they believed that liberty was made possible by underlying cultural conditions. It is not sufficient to affirm simply universal principles of liberty. In order for such principles to abide and to produce concrete good in society, the people must be prepared for them. Take this striking statement by probably a lesser-known founder, Gouverneur Morris. Gouverneur is his first name, not his title. Gouverneur Morris, he was the ambassador of France in 1792. This is 3 years before the. He's talking about the French here. Here's a quote: "In effect, time is needful to bring forward slaves to the enjoyment of liberty." Okay, he's talking about the French. Time, education. But what is education? It is not learning. It is more the effect of society on the habits and principles of each individual, forming him at an early period of life to act afterwards the part of a good citizen and to contribute in his turn to the formation of others. Hence, it results that the progress toward freedom must be slow. Now, reading that again, conservatives would probably call that socialism. That is the idea that you act the part of a good citizen that contributes in his turn to the formation of others. Like that's kind of a more communal sort of understanding of social formation, which conservative individualism tends to hate. All right, the founders, though they were generally open and optimistic toward newcomers, they affirmed that culture undergirded the proper exercising of universal natural rights. Those who lack the culture cannot properly exercise the rights and will ultimately undermine the rights of others. Okay. All right, the great Princeton theologian Charles Hodge, he had this to say. He said, "If it be then the distinction of Anglo-Saxon Christians that they are a Sabbath-keeping people, it is one to be highly prized and sedulously guarded. And in this country especially, we should be watchful lest the influx of immigrants and other nationalities deprive us of this great distinction and its blessing." So for Hodge, who was a Sabbatarian, of course, as a good Presbyterian, he wanted to maintain that. But he looked around him and he noticed most immigrants were not Sabbatarians, and that undermined it, and probably draw a narrative to where we are today through that. A little later, Henry Cabot Lodge, who is a name we should know, appealed to Anglo-Saxonism among old stock Americans to enact the highly restrictive Immigration Act of 1924, an act that's largely forgotten among a lot of people, which was the law of the land until 1965. 1965 is when the floodgates were opened for immigration. And as I said, Anglo-Saxonism was on the minds of a diverse crowd. Even the left believed this, such as Jack London. In fact, it makes more sense as a left-wing socialist who's for the workers to want to limit immigration. That's why left liberalism today is kind of silly, where they talk about the poor, huddled masses, but in the end they subject their own people to lower wages and all that. But it was also on the mind of my buddy J. Gresham Machen, the father of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. In his famous book, Christianity and Liberalism, in 1923, he writes this: "God grant that there may come a reaction and that the great principles of Anglo-Saxon liberty may be rediscovered before it is too late." That's 1923. All right, so in conclusion here, I'm at the end here. Now, in this talk, I have not, I admit, given a comprehensive and positive alternative to what today goes by, an alternative to conservatism. In my defense, I've been trying to provide an alternative for quite some time, so you can read my other work on that. But I will suggest that we find a solution in the paleoconservative tradition, the American paleoconservative tradition, which avoids pernicious ideology, and it also avoids paleoconservatism recognizes this universal truth, that the connection of people and place matters for communities to live well. It rejects the notion of humanity, not by denying that there is a rational species of animal named man, but by arguing that its universal content is insufficient basis on which to build a civil community. In other words, what is simply true of humans in their abstracted sense, abstracted from culture, is not sufficient to build a flourishing civil community. There has to be more to that, and I would argue there has to be more particular features, as I've said. So civil communities, let's kind of suppress our need to talk about humanity. Let's talk about civil communities that are a particular people, ordered for the common good, a good that includes religion, culture, language, heritage, sacred sites, and other shared particulars. And I want to note that outsiders are received into the people due to ordered hospitality. So I'm not saying that we cannot receive outsiders, that foreigners cannot come to this country. I'm not saying we deny entrance to non-whites. That's not the point of my talk here. What I'm saying, though, is that they have to be received into a people with demands for conformity and assimilation. And also it has to be limited. So lastly, when we think of American liberty, we cannot separate it from our fathers and our history. So one of my favorite songs, really hymns, is this one. And you've heard it before, I'm sure. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty. There's the liberty. Of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died. Land of the pilgrim's pride, ancestry and history. From every mountainside, place, ancestry, history, place, let freedom ring. All right, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Dr. Wolfe. We're going to take a quick